So in looking ahead before the season to week 7 of 2015, Pitt, Georgia Tech, we would have expected the Yellow Jackets to be the team we would focus on in trying to defend its division championship, but it's actually the Pitt Panthers at 2-0, 4-1 overall, who are in much better shape than the Yellow Jackets at this point. Can you imagine the Yellow Jackets going 0-4 to start ACC play? We bring in Mike McDaniel of Inside the ACC to help us break down Pitt going to Atlanta to take on Georgia Tech. Let's talk about Georgia Tech, Mike. We'll start out with the Yellow Jackets coming off one of its worst rushing efforts ever in the last outing against North Carolina. I believe the total was 71 yards on the ground. And if you know anything about Georgia Tech football, that's unacceptable and it's inconceivable considering that they're usually in the top 3 in the country in rushing the football. And if they can't run it, they probably can't rely on just about anything else in that offense.
Yeah, so they don't play well against North Carolina, but they still somehow put up 31 points. Now, their rushing attack wasn't there. Justin Thomas, I just checked the stat there, threw for 168 yards in that game. How often can you say Justin Thomas even throws over 150 yards in a game, maybe even 125 yards? I mean, it doesn't happen too often. And, you know, if he's in throwing situations and he throws the ball, I don't know, he put the ball up a ton in that game. You know, anytime he's going to, you know, put the ball up, you know, like 20 plus times, you know that Georgia Tech probably is not in a very good position to win the football game. And Georgia Tech kind of had to storm back, you know, storm back from behind. It was kind of a back and forth affair. And UNC late fourth quarter kind of put the thing away, outscoring the Yellow Jackets 14-3 in the second half. And then this past weekend, Georgia Tech goes down to Clemson, and Clemson's coming off that huge emotional win over Notre Dame, and that weekend that felt like the entire East Coast was impacted by that hurricane. And you're thinking, oh, okay, maybe it's time for Clemson to have a letdown. Georgia Tech could get that one signature win to put them back on the map. Well, it didn't happen. Their defense doesn't show up, and that's been an issue for much of the season for Georgia Tech. Their defense has just been on the field a little bit too much. And they give up 43 points to a Clemson offense that is very good, but maybe not quite exceeding or meeting even their own expectations set before them before the season. So Georgia Tech's kind of in a precarious situation right now. First of all, you don't want to start the ACC season 0-4, and that would be 5 straight losses for them because they lost to Notre Dame and out in South Bend there for their 3rd game of the season and kind of started the streak of losses. So if they lose this Saturday against Pittsburgh, there's no telling. I mean, it could be a situation where Georgia Tech's going to have to really fight hard to just make a bowl game. So that's not something we envisioned entering the season. They were picked by many to win the ACC Coastal. I did not pick them to win the Coastal, but I thought that they would be matching up with Virginia Tech in a game later down the line there in November. And I thought that would kind of decide who wins the Coastal Division. So while I didn't pick Georgia Tech to win the division, I thought they'd be right there. And right now, it looks like it's going to be anything but that, at least to this point in the season.
Yeah, like you, Mike, I did not predict Georgia Tech to win the division, but it had to do much with the schedule. They have to play Clemson and Florida State out of the other division. They have the date with Notre Dame, of course, that they already played and looked bad and trailing 30-7, couldn't close that one out and lost the game. I didn't expect them to lose to the likes of North Carolina and Duke. So while Georgia Tech wasn't my pick, I thought that they possibly were still the best team in the division, just the schedule would jump up and get them. But it hasn't been anything close to the type of performance through 6 games that we expected out of the Yellow Jackets at 2-4, 0-3 in the ACC. On the other hand, Pitt is off to a nice start at 2-0 in the conference, coming off a 7-point win over Virginia. Pitt's only a 57-yard field goal at Iowa away from being undefeated themselves. The Hawkeyes are 6-0. They're playing well in the Big Ten, so Pitt nothing to be ashamed about in regards to that one blemish on their schedule to date. So the Panthers not getting a whole lot of traction on the national radar or even much credibility at this point within the ACC. But if they can go on the road and despite Georgia Tech's trouble, go to Atlanta, win this game, move on to 5-1, win their first 3 ACC games, that really sets up Pitt to play well into November for a division championship.
Yeah, and people kind of just brush that Iowa loss aside. Like, okay, Iowa's not a good football team. Like, are you kidding me? Iowa's undefeated right now. They got a date with Northwestern this weekend. I understand Northwestern is coming off of a game against Michigan where they got their doors absolutely blown off of them in that one. I believe it was like 38-0, something like that. So that game was a blowout. But Northwestern, don't get me wrong, is a good football team. They ran into a red-hot Michigan team there and ended up losing that game. But this Iowa-Northwestern game this weekend is huge for Iowa, and Iowa can put themselves most likely in the top 15 and in the driver's seat there in the Big Ten in a position to maybe surprise, sneak up on a lot of people. And Iowa was expected to be a good football team, but yeah, a lot of people are kind of brushing that Pittsburgh's loss aside. It's like, okay, you lost to Iowa. Well, Iowa's a pretty good team this year, so that's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, 57-yard field goal. I mean, I think we can cut Pittsburgh a little bit of slack. Right now, Pat Narduzzi coming over from Michigan State, he was the defensive coordinator there, and we all know how good Michigan State's defense was the past couple seasons. He comes over, replaces Paul Chryst there at Pittsburgh, and you're looking at what Pittsburgh's doing there. They're 7th in total defense. They had an incredible game against Virginia Tech a couple weeks ago, albeit against an offense that's not necessarily that good. But it was a very good, a statement win for Pittsburgh going on the road to Blacksburg and winning that game. And Pittsburgh wins this past weekend against UVA, and it struggled there. Their offense didn't have a great day, but defensively, they were able to make some plays there in the secondary and pull out a win there against a pesky Virginia team that tried to make more of a game of it than it probably should have. So Pittsburgh's defense has been driving them to victory here of late. Of course, they lost James Conner at the beginning of the season to injury, but they've had a nice season for Quadri Allison, who's rushed for 476 yards in 4 touchdowns. He's been in and out of the lineup due to various injuries. But Pittsburgh always seems to have a stable of running backs to turn to, and they're a team that's extremely effective in the rushing game, and that they're kind of an old school football team in that regard. They had a game last weekend. Chris James came in for Allison and rushed the ball 11 times for over 90 yards, and he played well in that game as well. So it's not like Pittsburgh has a shortage of running backs. They're going to play good defense with Narduzzi there, and Nate Peterman at quarterback has had a relatively decent season. He's turned the ball over at some points a little more often than you would hope, but he's adequate enough with the running game that they possess that Pittsburgh can be a force to be reckoned with, especially with the defense that they have. So what's going to be interesting this weekend is how they stand up against a Georgia Tech team with kind of a different offensive look than many teams in the country with that option attack. Georgia Tech's lost 4 in a row, but that's not to say that their offense can't still be explosive. It definitely can, and I know that Pat Narduzzi will have those guys ready to face that Georgia Tech attack, which is unlike any offense that we see in college football.
Mike, it's an odd personnel situation at Pitt. They have had an average football team, barely get to bowl games, usually win their 6 to 7 football games per year. But as you mentioned, they have 2 of the more dynamic players in college football at their particular positions. Unfortunately, lost James Conner in the opener, the ACC Player of the Year in 2014, running for 26 touchdowns. Tyler Boyd, one of the best in the business at wide receiver. Their quarterback position interests us as well. We talked a lot during the offseason and prepped all the teams across the ACC, and we're looking at Chad Voite coming off a sophomore season in which he was really effective down the stretch. He's not the type guy that's going to throw the ball 40 times and carry the team on his back, but he was the guy for this Pitt Panther team and played really well down the stretch. He starts the season, statistically played well, but lost the job to Nathan Peterman, who's now the starter for Pitt. As you mentioned, the Panthers, kind of an old school football team, slugged it out against Virginia Tech. Didn't look very impressive against Virginia, only beating possibly the worst team in the conference by a touchdown. Lose the game at Iowa, but here they stand at 4-1 and 2-0 in the conference, and they look to be a really solid football team. You mentioned the defense, 7th rated in the country. I would expect we really have a story on our hands, Mike, if they maintain the 7th ranked total defense in the country, because yes, aside from Iowa, workmanlike type of offense that's not going to gain a ton of yardage, and aside from basically that game, that's probably the best offense that they've faced this year. The tougher teams are coming, and it starts to a certain extent, despite the issues with the Georgia Tech rushing attack against this Georgia Tech offense, and with it being a road game, this is probably one of the reasons why Pitt's a 2.5 to 3 point underdog in Atlanta.
Yeah, the whole matchup is just interesting, and the way Pittsburgh's played this year is kind of eye-opening to a degree because you weren't sure what you were going to get out of the offense with James Conner out. You knew Tyler Boyd was dynamic on the outside, And we all assumed that Chad Voidick was just going to be the quarterback. And all of a sudden, Chad Voidick's now used kind of in wildcat situations. He's brought in as the running quarterback. So it's not like Chad Voidick's like just not being played at all. I mean, he only had 2 carries against Virginia, but he's been used more in some games prior to the Virginia game as their running quarterback. So he's still getting some playing time, but we weren't expecting Nate Peterman to come in and all of a sudden just be the starting quarterback. And we've seen that Quadri Allison is the starting running back, and then he gets a little bit banged up. They bring other guys in, like I said, Chris James, but Allison only ran for 49 yards against Virginia. He's been hampered by some injuries there to the lower body off and on, so they don't want to run him too often. He would carry the ball 13 times, so I think if they can keep him under 20, and still be effective in the run game, that's kind of what they prefer. But I think with Pittsburgh, what to watch this weekend against Georgia Tech is, can they stop Justin Thomas? And a lot of teams have kind of figured him out this year. But if Pittsburgh can find a way to get past Georgia Tech, they have a schedule remaining in the ACC that's relatively favorable. They go on the road to play against Syracuse, and you and I previewed all the conference schedules and talked about all of this, in the preseason. But Pittsburgh's one of those teams that does not have one of the tougher schedules in the ACC. Beating Virginia Tech was huge. If they can get past Georgia Tech this weekend, they would be en route to perhaps a date down the line against a Miami team at the end of the season that, if they win that game, they could be the representative for the Coastal Division in the ACC Championship. So that's kind of the road it's heading down. They do have a home date with North Carolina coming up as well in a couple of weeks that could present some challenges, but they don't play Florida State. They don't play Clemson, and they're not playing Boston College this year, who has one of the elite defenses in the ACC. So the schedule is favorable enough. If Pittsburgh just relies on their defense, they'll be able to win a lot of these games down the stretch. This weekend, though, against this Georgia Tech offense, like you said, Georgia Tech's a 3.5-point favorite or 2.5-point favorite at home. And even though I like Pittsburgh to stay in the race and potentially win the Coastal Division down the line, they're my favorite to win it as of right now. I think they actually lose this game this weekend against Georgia Tech. I think that they're coming off of a win a couple weeks ago against Virginia Tech and a win against Virginia. They did not look very good there at home against the Cavaliers in their homecoming game. And I think this Georgia Tech team is going to sleep on a lot of people just because they haven't played that well. And I think if we see Georgia Tech play up to their potential with that option offense, it could surprise Pat Narduzzi's defense there for the Panthers. So I like Georgia Tech to win this game. It's essentially a toss-up, and for good reason. Pittsburgh is kind of, I don't want to say the anti-Boston College, but that's kind of what they are. They're kind of what you would expect Boston College to be if Boston College had a mediocre offense. That's really what Pittsburgh has at this point, and it's enough to get the job done as they continue to lean on their defense. But I like Georgia Tech to make one more play than Pittsburgh and perhaps win this game on Saturday.
Okay, Mike, so I've got this straight, that Pitt does not win at Georgia Tech, but they do win the Coastal Division.
Yep, they don't win at Georgia Tech, but they're able to win the Coastal Division. I like them to beat North Carolina. They have a game against Notre Dame that they could lose, but it's out of conference, so it's not going to count against them in conference play. And they have Louisville down the line. I don't like Louisville that much. I think their only real win is against NC State, and NC State isn't as good as we kind of thought that they would be. And the only other tough game on their schedule, in my opinion, is Miami at the end of the season. So you're looking at perhaps if they get past Georgia Tech, if they were to win against Georgia Tech, I think they have a great chance to win the Coastal. But even if they lose against Georgia Tech, I mean, Georgia Tech already has 3 losses in conference, so I don't think Georgia Tech's going to catch them if Pittsburgh were to win out. So the tie break essentially doesn't matter at this point if they have 1 loss. I mean, if that's the only loss Pittsburgh has and it's to Georgia Tech, they're going to put themselves right in position in the Coastal Division. Because, I mean, who else? I mean, North Carolina right now is unblemished in conference. They could make a run at the Coastal. Duke perhaps can make a run at the Coastal as well. But I really like Pittsburgh's defense, so I still think that if they lose against Georgia Tech on Saturday, they could still win this division. I mean, it's wide open this year. It's as wide open as it's ever been.
All right, the Pitt Panthers looking for a 3-0 start in the ACC and 5-1 overall, going to Georgia Tech on Saturday. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC helping us break it down. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.